All right. Welcome, everybody. It is October 6th, and this is the Cluster API Provider Azure Weekly Office Hours meeting. We are a project from SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and as such, we abide by their rules, which you can read about and follow a link at the top of this document. But basically, it boils down to everybody try to be nice to each other. Let's try to use the raise hands feature so that we don't talk over each other, and let's make sure everybody has enough time to ask their questions and has fun. So this is the point where if anybody is brand new to this meeting, I'll be quiet for a second. You can unmute and introduce yourself if you want to. I think it looks like we have the usual suspects, but let me pause for a second. Okay. Yeah, if you want to add your name to the attendee list up here for networking purposes or whatever, that's very helpful. And let's move on to open discussion. Jack, you want to talk about why the AKS tests are failing and what we want to do?
Yes, so they are failing, as far as I can tell, because we build with so we have one AKS scenario that we test for Azure Managed Cluster, and that test includes a Windows node pool, and Windows AKS support for 124 has dropped due to a CVE. So I'm not sure. I think they're rolling out something to all the existing customers to address that. But for new clusters, you can't build a 124 cluster with a Windows pool. So that means that we are at the mercy of that 124 support being re-engaged from AKS when that CVE is addressed, or updating our test cluster configuration somehow, either remove remove the Windows node pool from the cluster scenario. That doesn't seem like a super desirable thing to do, or potentially use Kubernetes 1.23 instead of 1.24 to get that end-to-end test coverage. Does that make sense as background? Cool. Sip of coffee length pause is probably an appropriate length. So
Akinlolo, you have a question? Sorry, I probably mangled your name.
That was a thumbs up on the question about context.
Well, thumbs up, sorry.
Made sense to me.
As you guys can tell, I'm a low vision user. I do my best here. All right, thanks.
Cool.
Yeah,
I didn't even see that.
Makes sense to me, Jack.
Okay, cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and state the assertion that downgrading to 123 is the preferable choice between those two, and then we can move on unless someone disagrees. But if no one disagrees, then I'll go ahead and drive that change, and then we can go to the next topic.
Anybody?
Cool. Going once, going twice.
Thumbs down or
to myself. Let's quick make a consensus before Cecile gets to
can say anything. All right, decision done. Bam. Oh, it sounds like that's the way to go. I agree. Cool. Is there anything else about reverting the tests? Should we move on? Let's go on to
I think we're good, yeah.
Yeah, let's go on to the server-side apply changes, which I'm guessing is why some folks are here.
Ashutosh, are you volunteering to take this over for me? Great. Hot potato, it's yours.
Yep.
All right, next item.
Sure. Yeah, I was just here to offer help, Jack. Like I have some context on that one, and I did some testing like last time and figured out the problem, and maybe I'll pull your commit and build over that, and that is fine with me.
Yeah, that's great. Just I'll interrupt for a second, just for context. I see Stefan is here, and so last week, Stefan, Ashutosh has actually run into the race conditions in his environment, so he offered to do some tests, which is great because it's not necessarily the easiest thing to run into. At least we don't think so. So thanks for that again, Ashutosh.
I was also like discussing with Stefan on this. So I have like a thought that we should probably add the name field into the subnet template spec so that we don't need to drop the other name field. I think Stefan has summarized it very well. So if anybody has any objection on that part, or I'll just try to build that change and try to verify, and obviously we'll get reviewed and we can discuss that as well.
Maybe it makes sense to just open the pull request and show that one post just to give some context on that name field and the structs and what we can do. Matt,
Awesome.
it would be
Matt, I'll paste it in
PR
chat
the
for you.
agenda. It's already in the agenda. If you want.
Oh yeah, cool. So you can click through that, Matt. It's the link under the open discussion item we're talking about. That Mike is currently highlighting. 2636.
The only thing I see in chat is Cecile saying, "Sorry, I'm late." So.
Oh no, sorry,
No,
it's
Matt.
not in chat. I was wrong. It's in the agenda
Oh, sorry.
doc right there.
In the doc, yes.
Then I think we can go pretty far down.
Let's review every thread conversation. Let's not do that.
Sorry, are we looking for particular comments, Stefan? Near the...
Yeah, that's the one. Stop.
Cool.
Okay, so one thing I think we identified for discussions the last few weeks is that we have to introduce a name field in the Azure cluster template, because we have to be able to set a name in the Azure cluster template so that we can also specify it in a cluster class, so we get the name field in the Azure cluster eventually. And there are essentially two options. So what Azure, what the idea was with Azure cluster and Azure cluster template, essentially that they're not sharing all fields, they're just sharing some fields, so that there are no fields that don't make sense in the Azure cluster template. So that was some kind of optimization, and that's why we currently don't have a name. So essentially looking at the struct structure, which is more or less like the second and the third section I have there. So in Azure cluster, we have like Azure cluster network spec, etc., etc. And then eventually subnet class spec. In Azure cluster template, we have network template spec, subnet template spec, subnet template spec. Oh, that's twice, sorry. And subnet class. And what both are sharing is subnet class spec. So as of today, in Azure cluster, the name field is in subnet spec. And the question is essentially, should we introduce the name field as part of subnet template spec, so that it would be essentially duplicate between both types? Or should we introduce it as part of subnet class spec? But that means that we would have to drop it from subnet spec, which is a struct in Azure cluster. So essentially 1 and 2. What we just don't know is if you consider dropping the name field from subnet spec to move it down one layer into an embedded struct, a breaking change in Azure cluster. And if you would rather do it instead in subnet template spec, or if it's fine. I mean, both options work for achieving what we want, getting server-side apply to work. It's just a matter of, do you want to keep a struct compatibility, or is YAML compatibility good enough for you?
Jack, I think you raised your hand first.
I just wanted to make sure that for folks who aren't following exactly that the surface area that we need to backfill with this name field is in the cluster class. It's entirely constrained to cluster class, which is experimental, which offers us the advantage of being able to more rapidly move forward on this. And that is only reflected in option 2. So to me, that's why option 2 might be more preferable. In addition to the fact that it's doesn't require us to change 2 surface areas. But I just wanted to give folks some more background so they could form their own opinions. Go ahead, Cecile.
One question I had is how do defaults work? By that I mean, in this situation, we have name, which is the unique identifier of a subnet, which is a required field in the subnet spec. If we were to add it to subnet template spec, would we still want it to be required, or would we want to leave it optional in case, maybe you do want to set a name for your subnet, but maybe you don't want to have like a template name so that each cluster can have different subnet names. In which case, if we want different defaulting, then it would make sense to do number 2. Yeah. Yasin?
So it's not strictly related to that, but like another question that I had with the first option is regarding how breaking of a change it is basically for non-cluster class users, meaning that like if we drop the name field from the subnet spec, where would we push that, and if it's on the same object or not, or whether we would be able to map it to the new field.
Cecile?
It's not a user API breaking change in the sense that we're going to be essentially moving the field from being in the spec or in the struct directly to being in another struct that itself is embedded in that struct. So yeah, this is probably not clear just by looking at this comment, but subnet class spec is actually embedded into subnet spec. And so subnet class spec is meant to be everything that is shared between subnet spec and subnet template spec. It's how it was designed originally. And so if we remove it from subnet spec but add it to subnet class spec, essentially it will still be part of subnet spec, just in a sub-nested struct instead of being and so it's not an API breaking change that for users it won't change anything in the YAML like Stefan was saying, but it is like a code like Go breaking change in the sense that if you were relying on like subnet spec dot name, then in the code, then you will have to change that to subnet spec dot subnet class spec dot name.
Okay, so I guess yeah, like it's not breaking use cases such as like users bring in their own network and like set in a bunch of things beforehand and not relying on CapZ to provision things. And like the other thing is like it depends on what is the policy for providers. I know that for CAPI, for example, we do have guarantees around the types and like the functions and the consumption of the code in general, but I don't know if we do have something like that for the providers.
Jeff?
Well, it is actually, users are bringing this configuration. So what we're asserting is that because the change we're making has to do with changing the way that the user-facing struct is composed, that it should not be user affecting. But in fact, the users do use this property. Is that right, Cecile?
What do you mean by users? Who's users in this case, and in what way do they use it?
In a bring your own subnet, in a bring your own VNet subnet scenario, the name.
Oh, this has nothing to do with bring your own or not bring your own. Everyone uses it the same way. So whether you bring your own or you don't bring your own, you have to specify a name.
Got it. Well, I'm basically saying that the name field that is being moved around from one sibling of the embedded struct composition to another,
yeah,
or child or whatever, however you want to say it, that is a user-facing property. So
it is.
Users have this property reference in their templates.
Correct. But the template itself will not change. There will be no changes to template.
Yep, understood. It's just all going to be relying on the housekeeping of YAML marshaling into the Go types and all that kind of strongly typed rationalization during runtime. Exactly.
And then also to add on to what Yasin was saying about guarantees, we don't have such guarantees in CapZ currently. And in fact, when this change was first made, when we made the subnet cluster class spec type for the first time, this was like in the same API version, like NV1 beta 1. And so we did make that breaking change already. So just if that adds anything.
Got it. So we have a historical precedent for being able to do this without users noticing.
Yeah. Does anyone have any ideas about the defaults question?
I would answer. So
Go ahead.
just one final comment to the other one. So just because Jack mentioned there might be edge cases with YAML, I think we should be fine because in both cases it's totally independent of where you place the name field. You will see that you get the same OpenAPI schema and the same CRD, and kubectl, kubeAPI server, they only have that schema available. They don't know anything about our structs. So as long as the CRD is the same, the behavior will be the same. Only if someone is actually using the structs. I mean, then, yeah, of course, they have to set a name in the right place.
That's actually great because we should be able to determine that definitively during the PR process because we have test coverage for that. So when we generate the new OpenAI schema, we should see that there's no delta.
Yep, exactly. Regarding defaulting, I would lean towards making it mandatory, I think. Sorry, I think that was part of your statement before. So I think I would make name in both cases mandatory and in both cases a map key. Regarding defaulting, I'm not sure. I mean, are there good defaults that we could set in the Azure cluster template webhook? I think the one in Azure cluster uses a bunch of cluster specific, or at least one cluster specific field. So the defaulting that we could do in the Azure cluster template would at least lose that.
I think the defaulting we have for Azure cluster right now, and I might be wrong, but I think it uses cluster name. So it's like cluster name dash subnet dash node or something like that. So is that something we can do with cluster class?
The defaulting you would, okay, so I mean, if you want, were we talking about adding defaulting to the Azure cluster template webhook, or just in general somewhere?
In the webhook.
I mean, in the webhook, no, because when you deploy your cluster class with all the reference templates, then you just have the Azure cluster template, and the webhook can only act on that Azure cluster template once.
Right.
And you only have that once per cluster class. So you can't default it per cluster, essentially.
Right. So the only way to do like replicate that behavior would be to make it non-required and then have a default when the cluster is created per cluster.
Yes, but I think that would lead into the problem that we currently have.
Yeah.
That essentially the name is not specified in the Azure cluster template, and then they're fighting.
Okay. So we're saying that users would have to hard code their subnet names to something that is common among all their clusters from the same cluster class. Do we think that's going to be a problem? Like, do we have any users out here who are like, hold on, that doesn't sound like a good thing?
I think we can go one step further. So let's say we introduce the name field in Azure cluster template. There are still two possible ways to get to your subnets. One way is to just have it in your Azure cluster template directly. The other way is to do it via variables. So what you could do is you could write, or let's say variables and patches. What you could do is you could write a patch which has access to some properties of your cluster, like the cluster name, and then just generate subnets, basically based on YAML templating. And there you have access to the cluster name. So the patch is essentially the part which makes your whole, all your templates, your entire cluster, your entire general shape of the cluster class specific to a cluster. So while running patches, you could generate a subnet which does exactly that defaulting. To be verified, but I'm pretty sure it should work.
Sorry, just to clarify, when you say generate a subnet, would that be adding in a completely new subnet, or would that be like modifying one of the base ones? Like, let's say my cluster class has like subnet node and subnet control plane. Could I like patch subnet node to be called like subnet my cluster node?
You can't with inline patches because we only allow appending and prepending to arrays and not modifying like the first array element or something. You could replace the entire array, but you can't take
Okay.
the subnet's field value of the Azure cluster template as input and then modify it or something. That doesn't work. What you can do is you can write an external patch, and then you can do everything. You get all templates, your entire cluster class essentially, and then you can generate patches to modify whatever you want.
Okay, so there are ways. It's not super
ways.
straightforward, but there are ways. Okay.
Exactly.
So I think I'm leaning towards option 1 in that case. and then making it required. For the people who said +1 option 2, you have leftover like concerns after the discussion?
I think those were before the discussion.
Yeah.
So maybe let's revisit.
Yeah.
Sounds like we have a rough consensus for option 1.
This is why we all get together in person, to make things as confusing as possible.
There would be one other minor thing potentially on that PR that could be good to talk about, just to maybe have a similar discussion on why it makes sense or doesn't make sense. There was yeah, just scroll down slowly maybe. And yep, further. I hope I see it. Yep, that one here. Okay, so what we have here is essentially in the Azure cluster template, a slice, which has a slice of structs, and that struct has just a single value. And I think the result of that conversation was essentially that single value in that struct, in that slice struct, is not unique. So we can't use it as map key. What I think is that we don't really need a list type map and list map key here, because the only reason we want those map keys is that we are able to have multiple controllers modifying the same field. And my impression is that that is not important for VNet peering template spec. I'm not sure if that's true.
Anyone know? Any opinions?
I guess, yeah, another question on top of that is ultimately, the question is, are we allowing to define those as part of a cluster class? Because if that's the case, then like you could end up with the two controllers fighting, especially if it's a slice that we were talking about here. Because ultimately, like everything can be defined as like as part of a cluster class. Whether it makes sense or not, that's like up for debate.
Yeah, the fun thing is that in the cluster class, the slice has just one field, and in the Azure cluster, it has 2 fields. The problems we were getting into with subnets was that the topology controller was creating subnets with some missing fields, and then the Azure cluster controller was modifying subnets. So the important thing that we have to know here is essentially if that, I don't remember the struct name, that VMnet peering thing, if that is also modified by the Azure cluster controller, or if it's essentially just taken as it's written by the topology controller, and that's it. We don't necessarily have to resolve it now, but
Okay. Cecilia, you had your hand up. Did it get covered or?
No, I just didn't know if my question was valid. I'm a bit lost, Stefan. Do you mind like do you mind just re-explaining like what the dilemma is?
So the only reason we want to introduce those map keys is that we can have multiple controllers writing the same field and having good merge behavior, not just I don't know, the topology controller is writing the field, and then the Azure cluster controller is overwriting the field, and then topology controller again and again and again. So my main point is, I think there is no good way to set a good map key on the slice, but I wonder if that slice is even written by the Azure cluster controller.
Okay.
You might have to go to the files tab to see what that field actually is.
So for subnets, I guess that was only happening because we had something that was like in the controller kind of writing back to that slice to write the ID. Okay. But we're saying that as long as like the user writes it and gets defaulted in the webhook, and then we don't write back to it in the controller, then it's fine.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I think we have to double check, but I'm pretty sure we don't write for that one. Although there are no guarantees that's not going to be a thing in the future. Like technically someone could make a change and then it becomes the case.
Yeah. Yassine?
Yeah, and I think like Stefan, like I guess as part of the changes for cluster class, we're documenting this specific behavior in the sense that like if you're adding something that is co-authored, then you have to have basically the like the list map key added to that field. So probably another thing is like in the developer's guide, for example, for CapZ and for Kappa and like for CapV, we could add more language or details specifically when you would need to add those when you're developing a feature for a provider.
Maybe some general statement. So we are only having this problem now because the topology controller is consistently applying YAML files. I would say in general, it totally depends on your API type. So it's even totally independent of the topology controller and cluster class, in my opinion. If you want to have fine granular merge behavior on fields, sorry, on slices, then you just have to set those markers, because otherwise you will always get atomic merges. So it's probably more like whenever possible, you should set those map keys. I mean, even kubectl applies using server-side apply and uses that merge behavior. It's probably everyone going forward. It's just that with topology control, it's more obvious because it permanently reconciles your resource. If a user runs kubectl apply, they usually probably just do it once. So it doesn't occur that often, but it's still not great. I think today, looking at the Azure cluster with that subnets name thing, you have the same problem. The user applies it without names. The Azure cluster controller is overriding the subnets. And when the user reapplies the same YAML, it's reset again, and then the Azure cluster controller has to override again. So I can definitely double check what we have in our documentation. I'm not sure. we definitely should have it documented. But it's probably good advice in general to look at every slice that you have and figure out if atomic merge behavior is good enough. I hope that makes sense.
Go ahead, Cecile.
Why are we not adding resource group to the slice? Like I'm just rereading resource group, and this is like the VNet resource group, right? Not the cluster resource group. So even if you had one cluster per resource group in the cluster class, like each cluster class cluster is in a different resource group, they could all still want to be peered with the same VNet that lives in the same resource group. Does that make sense?
Can you say that again, Cecile?
Okay, yeah, sure. So the struct we're looking at right now, it's called VNet peering. VNet peering in Azure is if you say, I want my VNet of my cluster to be peered with this other VNet that I have pre-existing.
Yep.
That VNet, what identifies it is its name and its resource group. Because in Azure, a VNet name is scoped by resource group. So you could have two VNets with the same name in two different resource groups. So you say, I want this specific VNet in resource group, my resource group called my VNet. Now, I think right now we're saying we don't want to add the resource group, which the resource group is in the VNet peering spec, but it's not in the VNet peering class spec. I think because we were working under the assumption that every cluster in the cluster class is a different resource group. But since we're not talking about the cluster resource group here, we're talking about the peered VNet resource group. That shouldn't change between cluster class clusters. That should be the same.
Okay. But then you could still have like VNets with the same name, like on different resource groups, right?
Correct. Yeah. Like for example, this is a totally valid use case. I can make a cluster class which says I want all my clusters in this cluster class to be peered with two VNets. The first one is called my VNet. It's in resource group prod. And the second one is called my VNet, and it's in resource group staging. And that could be completely valid.
Yeah.
Right now, we're not allowing that. Right now, we're just giving the name of the VNet, which is super imprecise because it's like, well, what VNet are we talking about?
Yeah.
I think that sounds good in general, but I think it doesn't change anything regarding the map key thing because the source group is optional. Okay, good. Just that I got it.
Ashutosh.
One question on this, like, let's say if we go via option 1, what happens to the existing template? Let's say I had an existing cluster template and, created a cluster out of it. Like we will have a name field in the subnet spec, right?
Stefan?
Like I'm thinking it's like
I
little
think I
context
can
on
answer.
it.
So I think it
Yeah.
doesn't really matter if it's option 1 or 2, because both options would introduce a new mandatory field called name in subnets. That's the same in both options. It's just a matter on in which struct or embedded struct we're putting it. So it's definitely the case that if you have a classic class today with Azure cluster template without a name, that won't work anymore. But that was I think the idea why Cecile wrote. That's acceptable because it's an experimental API to make this change to get to a good state, if I understood it all correctly. But considering that if you have a cluster class today with a subnet without names, you run into the infinite reconcile problem. I think it's probably good that doesn't work anymore, that you have to fix it and then it will work.
Yassine?
Yeah, pretty much what Stefan said. Like, I think like even if you were using this before, it wasn't working anyway. So it's like I'm not sure how breaking we can consider that because it was like broken from the beginning.
Yeah.
Ashutosh?
No, I think I should lower my hand. No answers.
Okay.
Thanks.
Cool. Do we you have any more to say about the SSA changes? Have you got all that, Ashutosh?
Yeah, kind of like, but I need to like revisit the PR. But yeah, I know like what to do. So
Yeah,
there
just
is
ping
nothing
me.
we can-
I think I got the important parts. Sorry for not listening.
No, go ahead, Stefan.
Awesome.
I was just saying, ping me if you have questions. I think I've got
Sure.
what you want to do.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stefan, for taking time on. Thanks, Cecile.
Yes, thanks very much.
So I just wanted to speak to Yassine's point really quickly, especially since we're being recorded. So that is totally correct that if something is already broken, we should consider that fixing that isn't a breaking change. However, I think we have to remind ourselves that as software engineers, the actual stuff that our software does is what's important and not the intention. So oftentimes we can unintentionally make our software do stuff and build customer bases that actually rely on stuff that's broken. And so I've had conversations like this in upstream Kubernetes where if you wait long enough, your unintended stuff that is working in a way that you don't becomes in effect a user contract. So it becomes breaking. So it's just a reminder to all of us, if we see stuff that's not working as intended, we have to fix that and address it as soon as possible. Otherwise, it can actually sort of concretize into user expectations. Then it becomes really difficult to fix, even though it's broken, if that makes sense.
It does. I think we've all seen stuff like that happen in the wild. That's why when we have a release, we say it's plug compatible because we didn't fix something right. Hopefully we don't say that very often. Should we move on to the next topic? Have anything else about SSA to say? All right, let's do. Jack, this is you about Azure Managed Cluster
Okay, cool.
features.
Thank you so much, everybody, for that conversation. I mean, I know I'm the PR author. I actually feel like I understand the least about this, so this is so hugely helpful. Thanks again, Stefan, for spending so much time on that. I wanted to briefly chat about something that's just been sort of bothering me at night. I say Azure Managed Cluster there, so I'm thinking about it from the context of AKS, of the Managed Cluster story, but I think that it really applies to anything. And but I think it's especially interesting with AKS because we're dealing with a sort of split authority between Cluster API and the managed backend service. So what I'm thinking about is how do we how do we make sure that when we introduce a feature for Azure Managed Cluster, that we can gracefully introduce that to existing customer clusters when they upgrade to this new version of CapZ? So the way we do this in CapZ by convention is that features are going to be triaged and shipped only with minor releases. But those are still supposed to be non-breaking I mean, let's set aside the fact that Azure Managed Cluster is experimental. We don't intentionally want to break anything. So if I'm, let's say, Mike, I saw you on the call. Mike, if you're using 1.5 of CapZ and we ship a new feature of AKS that you actually want to use and integrate into your clusters with 1.6, we want to do that in such a way where you just click your button or do kubectl edit the controller and update the image reference from 1.5 to 1.6. Now you're running 1.6 of CapZ, and ostensibly your new clusters can get this new functionality, and your old clusters are still going to work great. With AKS, there is sometimes with features that CapZ doesn't know about, AKS will apply its own opinionated defaults. So the thing I'm thinking about in my mind is the thing I've been working on, which is spot priority for AKS. So that's a sort of, I think folks with experiences in all clouds are sort of familiar with the concept of a spot VM, something that you can configure with like bidding configuration to conditionally provision VMs if they're cheap enough for your criteria. So Azure also has this functionality, and AKS supports it. So by default right now, AKS, if you build a cluster and you don't declare any sort of spot configuration, AKS is going to give you the non-spot configuration. It's going to create a node pool for you that doesn't include any spot configuration at all. And AKS has its own API data structure to express that. So up until this time, all the AKS clusters that CapZ has been creating have not declared any opinion and have sort of fallen into the AKS default. So with a feature that, as we introduce that feature with the next minor version of CapZ, we are now going to be responsible for doing for all the existing clusters that used to run on 1.5. We're going to now be processing future reconciliations against an updated data model in CapZ that includes knowledge of spot priority. And if we don't do that right, then we are going to be running into a situation where we update our data model on the next reconciliation after the upgrade. We send that put to the AKS APIs, and the AKS APIs reject that request because they say something like, "Oh, you can't change the spot priority configuration." And I'm alighting a little bit of the details how this might work. But you can sort of imagine that in a scenario where the backend managed cluster provider detects that the user doesn't configure any spot priority configuration, that it assigns its own, and then in a follow-up operation, if the user's API says something like spot priority equals false or something, or like an opinionated default that doesn't agree with what AKS put, then you're going to get an error that sort of falls under this is a mutable property. Sorry, this is an immutable property. You can't update this. So really the question I'm asking is, do we trust that our current end-to-end tests continually validate this story? Are the current upgrade tests sufficient for that? I know we don't actually have an upgrade test for AKS, but is the CAPI upgrade test that CapZ runs, does it do this for the CapZ surface area for the non-managed cluster? And so do we want to simply fork that upgrade test pattern into the Azure Managed Cluster scenario so that we can continually make sure that this situation doesn't happen to us when we ship a minor release? That was a lot of language. Hopefully it made sense. Cecile?
So the upgrade test, we have two types of upgrade tests currently for CapZ self-managed clusters. We have the Kubernetes workload upgrade test, which upgrades Kubernetes version only. It does not touch CapZ version, so that does not cover any of that. And then we have API version upgrade tests. Those are testing upgrading from one API version to another. I think what we have right now is upgrading from V1 Alpha 4 to the latest release of V1 Beta 1. So it would take like the less, like, let's say v0.5 for CapZ, and then upgrade to like v1.5.6 or whatever the latest release is. That offers some coverage in the sense that, like, if you add like a breaking change or feature, it's going to detect that because like it wasn't in v1 alpha 4. So when you upgrade to the latest, it's going to break. The thing about that though is it only detects it in the release. So it does, we don't have what I think our gap right now is an upgrade test that takes the latest release version of CapZ and upgrades to the branch or like the controller image that was made from that PR so that we can test it in PRs too. And I think, yeah, Stefan just pointed out, Cappy does have that. We just never implemented that in CapZ. So I think that's our main gap. And I think that would solve kind of or address what you're pointing at.
Okay, cool. I'll fold that into the graduate Azure Managed Cluster out of experimental test section, because I think we definitely want that. I mean, arguably we want this for non-AKS clusters as well. Stefan, is the pattern to create, is that upgrade test in Cappy, does the upgrade happen after the clusters have already been created? So you test the sort of in-place upgrade scenario to make sure that new versions of Cappy work nicely with pre-existing infrastructure?
So what we're doing is,
I suppose it's hard. The infrastructure part is hard because it's not really in scope for Cappy per se. You would need to choose a provider to do that.
to be honest, I wasn't listening the entire time, but I can tell
That's
you
okay.
what a test does. It's roughly at the beginning of a test, we create an additional workload cluster. We convert this workload cluster to a management cluster. Then we install the old version of all providers, so depending on what you want. Then we create a workload cluster on that with that second management cluster. After that work cluster is created, we upgrade the providers on that second management cluster. And once that is done, I think we do a scale up, like machine deployment, go from 1 to 2. And we verify that, oh, I'm not sure if we're doing the last part, probably not. But what we definitely verify is that after the providers have been updated, that there were no rollouts triggered. So like just upgrading from cluster API, I don't know, 1.1 to 1.2, it shouldn't trigger any machine rollouts. And that's what we're verifying in our test.
That's great. Okay, great. So I think there are some similar sort of provider-specific scenarios that we want to follow that pattern for.
We do have an issue out there saying we still want to fault in some CAPI tests into our E2E, so that covers it. We might want to have a more specific issue, but we have an intention to embrace those tests at some point. I don't think anybody's followed up on the issue. Cool. Anything else? Any other comments about this? Sorry,
one
go
last
ahead.
comment. So once we're done with checking that no rollout was triggered, and then we're doing a scale up to see that the new providers actually work. But that's the entire test.
That's great. I think any reconciliation, I mean, you could basically wait long enough for the standard reconciliation to trigger, but doing a scale out, I think, is sufficient. Because the concern I'm worried about is that you put the data model becomes non-forward compatible. And so any future operation on an existing cluster is going to have a disagreement with the backend managed cluster API. So so a scale out is totally appropriate.
But what we can definitely do is
that.
just, if there is more to clarify or something, just write it down somewhere in Slack or in an issue, and then we can check what the current test does, or if you can extend it, etc. So generally pretty open to just adding ways to hook into the test to do more things if necessary for providers.
So you raised, but then lowered your hand.
I saw that.
I was going to type in chat instead. You caught me. No, I was just going to say, can we open an issue for the specific test? Because I think we do have that one that Matt mentioned, but this isn't really like adding a test from Cappy that we don't have yet. It's reusing a test we're already using in a different way. And I think we should definitely add it for both managed and unmanaged clusters. And maybe we can do both in the same test. Who knows? Gotta investigate that.
Yeah. Makes sense. Well, shall we move on to release check-in time?
Yeah,
Let's
I
see.
added that. I wasn't sure if you already covered that earlier, but
We
I
didn't,
just
so I
thought we
mean,
should.
yeah. The idea was, well, a few meetings ago, we said we changed the policy so that we're potentially doing a patch release every week. We initially said we want to check in with all of you here at this meeting, and then we quickly thought that's probably not sufficient to include everyone who cares. So I dropped a little poll in the Slack channel, but I don't know that that was enough to get people's attention, and we didn't have anybody thumbs up or thumbs down. So at this point, I guess we're just sounding out, should we do a release this week? If people have strong feelings. Oh yeah, thank you, Jack. Let's see what would be in the actual release.
That doesn't seem right. I think that's a previous release diff.
No, that's right. I think
151 compared with yeah, this should do it, right?
For some reason, it's not showing the latest pushes though.
is it not showing things that
Or
cherry picked?
oh,
think-
never
I think
mind.
it's just not in
I think
order.
this is everything.
Oh, okay. It's from oldest to newest. That's why.
Right.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Also, I mean, I think we ought to because some of these are significant fixes. So why not? So there's a +1 from Jack, but actually the idea is we were also talking about this. Sorry, Cecile, that we would try to get it done today, if we all agree. If it slips off today, we don't want to do it on Friday, so we might wait till Monday. But ideally, we go ahead and do it today. Go ahead, Cecile.
No, please. I was gonna say basically the same thing. Do you want to finish your thought?
That's all.
Okay. Yeah, I'm also +1 for release. And yeah, I think if we can try to, given how quick the release process is now, if we have like with the automation, I think it's worth trying to do it the day of. Because we also happened to say we would do a release last Thursday on Monday and then kind of slipped up.
Yeah, that one kind of.
And then the other thing is we were talking with Matt. I think it'd be good if we can assign an owner when we do say we want to release, because otherwise it's kind of like, well, we want to release, but who's going to follow up on it? And I think right now, because of how it works, it has to be one of the maintainers, just because permissions, like you need permission to push the tag. So ideally, if we can just get one of the maintainers or people who have maintainer permissions in the call to kind of sign up, and we can rotate on who does it every time, I think that would be probably the best way to be accountable. And I guess Matt, Jack, you're the other maintainers here, so if you're okay with that.
Yep, I'd be happy to do it. Go ahead, Jack.
There's only one kind/bug in the PR queue. I haven't done a full audit to make sure that the labels are current, but that is, and that is actually something I'll follow up with you, Cecile, on offline. I'm not even sure we want that. So I think that's a really good signal that we want to release, that we're basically all the fixed bugs are in the queue at this point. There's nothing that folks are waiting for to get merged.
And no one seems to be giving it a thumbs down, so I think that's consensus. Go ahead, Cecile.
The other thing that we might want to check as part of this when we say like, do we want to release yes, no, is maybe take a quick peek at test grids. That's the thing we also forgot to do last time, which would have told us there was a bug that we shouldn't release right away. That way we make sure that we all do it together.
Sorry, I didn't have it bookmarked. I always have to hunt for it. There we go.
Not
Sound
main.
good.
Not main. I think we know what these two failures are, don't we?
What's the main one?
Not main?
Yeah. That's not
AKS.
good. We should
Just
check on
everything,
that.
every single possible failure in the
But
last
we
10
fixed
tries.
this one. That's the good thing.
Well, AKS is known. AKS is
Not,
is the Windows
not
issue we
in
talked.
main.
Yes,
Not
it
in
is.
main.
We're
Which one
testing
is it?
124 and Windows.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
that's what
Okay.
Windows
we're talking
124 is
about.
broken.
Okay,
Okay.
great. Okay, cool. Okay, and then the V1 beta 1 -1 is also
So -1,
different.
we have a different known failure for AKS, which is on discovered, which has to do with the delete failures. The V1 beta 1 test, the regular V1 beta 1 test. I know this is like kind of new, the naming, but the if you go to I can't even possibly explain where to find things on this page, so I'll stop trying. There's one right above that, actually.
This one, periodic.
That one, yeah, that's 1.5. So that looks really green. So the AKS failure again is going to. We can double check that 124 config is also in that branch, but I think that tracks with the 124 failure starting yesterday. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't want
we have success on 10.4, 10.3, 10.2. 124 broke on 10.5, and we have that signal there. So go ahead, Cecile.
Do we want to try to get one green signal from AKS after reverting 124 before getting the release? Or do we have that signal elsewhere somehow?
I think we should probably have I don't actually know the full scope of what it means to revert 124 support for Windows testing. So we might actually need to cut a release that removes that from CapZ so that our customers don't build an AKS cluster with a Windows pool with 124. Maybe we can have a huddle on that sometime in the next couple hours.
So is that
what I'm saying is that I'm not sure that fixing that test doesn't actually require us to change our capabilities. And so if it does, then that would need to land in the release branches before we release, or we would potentially use that as to say, we're not actually going to release, we're going to wait until AKS fixes this, or I don't know. We have to huddle on that.
So we're ready to release, except we want to get some clarity on the AKS, how we're going to fix that version.
I think that's fair.
Okay. All right. And as far as who's going to actually execute the release, I volunteer since Jack has done the last several. And I guess we don't want to continue talking about it here. We're just going to huddle offline or outside of this and figure it out. So we will try to do a release today unless we find that the AKS issue is something we can wrap up, but it doesn't happen today. And then in that case, we'll wait for that fix. Is that the general plan?
Yep, I think so.
All right. That sounds reasonable.
We'll talk about that next week. Let's let folks go.
Yep.
I think that's best. Cramming that into the last 5 minutes is
that what time we're? Oh yeah, we are. Cool. Does anyone have anything else that's not on the agenda we want to talk about?
I was hoping to get some guidance on the status update on cluster class and managed clusters, but that can also wait till next week, or if it's something quick.
Anybody know anything? Have we made any progress
I think
there?
we could say there's no status change. Go ahead,
Okay.
Cecile.
I think last week you brought this up and we said that it would be great to have an issue as a first step. Did you get to opening that issue? I don't think I saw that come
You
through.
did, yeah.
Yeah, it was in
Okay,
show.
great.
Yeah, I can paste that in chat.
Okay, yeah, could you share that and then we can maybe talk about it on that issue offline.
Sounds good. Anything else? All right. We will see everybody hopefully next week. Thanks for coming. Thanks for all the great discussion. I learned a lot. Hopefully everybody else did.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
See you soon.
Thank you, Matt.